A trembling little black girl stands before the towering giant cowboy, her voice unwavering as she declares, "I'll marry you when I grow up," then vanishes for 12 years, only to return as someone no one expected. The frontier town erupts in cruel laughter, dismissing the child's bold promise as foolish fantasy. They expect her to disappear into obscurity, forgotten like dust in the wind. But the gentle giant cowboy watches her departure with unexpected longing, carrying her memory through lonely years as the town's protector. When a sophisticated woman arrives 12 years later, she brings secrets that could transform everything, or destroy the fragile hope that has sustained them both. Hidden beneath her refined exterior lies an inheritance that will challenge every assumption the town has made about worth and power. Will the community recognize the girl who dared to dream, or will buried prejudices crush the promise that could save them all? The dust swirled around 8-year-old Etta Mae Harper's bare feet as she hurried down the main street of Clearwater Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows between the weathered wooden buildings of the frontier town. Her patched dress hung loose on her small frame, and her hair was pulled back with a fraying ribbon. She clutched a basket of freshly washed clothes against her chest. Her grandmother Sarah had sent her to deliver the laundry to the wealthy families on the east side of town. Each step reminded Etta of her place in this world. The townspeople barely glanced at her as she passed. When they did notice her, their expressions ranged from indifference to outright disdain. At Morrison's general store, she approached the counter with 2 coins. The shopkeeper looked down at her with cold eyes. "We're closed," he said, though 3 white customers browsed the shelves behind him. Etta's stomach growled, but she nodded and turned away. This happened everywhere she went. The bakery, the pharmacy, even the church steps where she sometimes sat to rest. The message was always the same. She didn't belong. The other children were worse than the adults. They whispered behind her back and laughed when she walked by. Sometimes they threw pebbles or pushed her when no one was watching. Etta had learned to keep her head down and move quickly through the streets. Back at the small cabin she shared with her grandmother, Etta helped hang wet sheets on the line behind their home. Sarah Harper moved slowly, her weathered hands showing the effects of decades spent washing other people's clothes. She watched her granddaughter with worried eyes. "Child, you remember what I always tell you." "Yes, grandmama, keep my head up and my heart strong." Sarah nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the old family Bible sitting on their tiny kitchen table. Hidden between its pages were documents she had protected for 8 long years. Papers that could change everything for Etta, but only when the time was right. The child wasn't ready yet. The world wasn't ready for what those papers contained. The annual Founders' Day celebration filled the town square with music and laughter. Colorful banners hung between buildings, and the smell of roasted corn and fresh bread drifted through the air. Families gathered on blankets while children ran between the booths and games. Etta stood at the edge of the festivities, watching from a distance. She longed to join the other children, but she knew better than to try. Her grandmother was working late at the mayor's house, scrubbing floors for the party that would follow the public celebration. 3 boys about her age noticed her standing alone. They approached with mischievous grins. "Look what we found," one of them said, "a little beggar girl." They began pushing her toward the horse corral at the edge of the square. Etta stumbled but kept her balance. The horses stamped and snorted behind the wooden fence, sensing the commotion. "Maybe she wants to swim with the horses," another boy laughed. They pushed harder, and Etta felt herself losing her footing near the water trough. Fear shot through her chest, but she refused to cry out. She had learned that showing fear only made things worse. A shadow fell across the group. The boys looked up and immediately stepped back. Etta turned to see the largest man she had ever encountered. Jedediah Coulter stood 6 feet and 8 inches tall, with broad shoulders and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. His reputation as the gentlest soul in Clearwater Creek was matched only by stories of his strength. "Boys," Jed said quietly, "I think your mothers are looking for you." The children scattered without another word. Jed knelt down to Etta's level, his massive frame somehow making her feel safer rather than afraid. "You hurt, little one?" Etta shook her head. She studied his face, noting the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Something about this man was different from everyone else in town. He looked at her like she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. Jed stood and brushed the dust from his hat. He started to walk away, but Etta's voice stopped him. "I'll marry you when I grow up." The words rang out clear and strong across the square. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The entire celebration seemed to freeze for a moment before erupting into laughter. Adults pointed and shook their heads at the absurdity. Children giggled and repeated her words in mocking tones. Jed turned back to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something gentle in his eyes. He reached out and patted her head softly. "We'll see, little one." Sarah Harper appeared at Etta's side, having heard the commotion from across the square. She took her granddaughter's hand and led her away from the laughing crowd. As they walked home, Sarah's grip on the child's hand was firm but reassuring. That night, Sarah sat by lamplight reading her Bible. Her fingers traced the edges of the hidden documents. Soon, she thought, very soon, everything would change for her brave granddaughter. If you are enjoying this story of how one little girl's bold promise will change an entire frontier town forever, don't forget to comment where you are tuning in from to show how this story can connect us across any distances, backgrounds, and hearts. Because what will happen in the next 15 minutes in Clearwater Creek will completely transform Etta's destiny and challenge everything the townspeople believe about worth and power. 3 months after the town's celebration, Sarah Harper's cough grew worse. The sound echoed through their small cabin at night, keeping Etta awake with worry. Her grandmother tried to hide her weakness, but Etta noticed how she gripped the furniture when walking and how she paused to catch her breath between tasks. The doctor visited twice but offered little hope. Sarah's lungs were failing, and there was nothing his medicine could do. Etta helped her grandmother with the washing, taking on more of the heavy lifting despite her small size. The other families in town showed no sympathy for their struggles. Late payments for laundry services became the norm. Sarah spent long hours staring at the family Bible on their kitchen table. Her weathered fingers would trace its worn leather cover, and sometimes Etta caught her whispering prayers over the old book. There was something important about that Bible, but Etta had never been allowed to look inside it without permission. One evening, as autumn winds rattled their windows, Sarah called Etta to her bedside. The older woman's breathing was labored, and her eyes held an urgency that frightened the child. "Come here, sweet girl. Grandmama needs to tell you something important." Etta climbed onto the bed and took her grandmother's frail hand. Sarah's skin felt paper-thin and cold. "Fetch me the Bible from the kitchen." Etta obeyed, carrying the heavy book carefully back to the bedroom. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, revealing papers tucked between the pages. Official documents with seals and signatures covered the yellowed parchment. "Your daddy was a smart man, Etta. Smarter than folks gave him credit for." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "He had a gift for seeing things others missed, patterns in the land, signs that told him where to find valuable things buried deep in the earth." She pulled out a deed and pointed to the formal writing. "Before he died, your daddy bought land back east, lots of it. The lawyers said it was worthless, but your daddy knew better." Etta stared at the papers without understanding. The words were too complex for her 8-year-old mind to grasp fully. "They found copper on that land, child. Lots of copper, more than anyone expected." Sarah gripped Etta's hands tighter. "You own it all. The mine, the land, everything. $50,000 in mining rights that could be worth much more." The numbers meant nothing to Etta, but she could see the importance in her grandmother's eyes. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because you weren't ready. Because this world ain't kind to little girls like you with big dreams and bigger inheritances." Sarah coughed violently before continuing. "I've been protecting these papers, waiting for the right time. That time is now." Sarah explained how Etta's father had possessed an unusual memory. He could look at land formations and remember exactly what he had seen months or years later. This gift helped him identify geological patterns that indicated valuable mineral deposits. The same ability lived in Etta, though she was too young to understand its power. You remember everything you see, don't you, child? Every face, every place, every detail. Etta nodded. She had always assumed everyone remembered things the way she did. Her grandmother smiled despite her pain. That's your daddy's gift. It's what made him special, and it's what will make you special too. 2 days later, a stranger arrived in Clearwater Creek. Cornelius Blackwood stepped off the afternoon stagecoach wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His pale eyes scanned the dusty street with obvious disdain. Word spread quickly through town about the fancy lawyer from Boston asking questions about the Harper family. Blackwood found their cabin easily enough. Sarah was too weak to leave her bed, so Etta answered his knock at the door. The man looked down at her with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "You must be Etta Mee Harper. I've come a very long way to meet you." He showed her official papers that matched the ones hidden in the Bible. Sarah had sent word to the lawyers back east about her declining health. It was time for Etta to claim her inheritance, but she would need to travel to Boston for her education and to properly manage her newfound wealth. "The arrangements have all been made," Blackwood explained to Sarah. "The child will receive the finest education money can buy. She'll learn business, literature, mathematics, everything she needs to handle her father's legacy." Sarah studied the man carefully. Something about his eagerness bothered her, but the documents appeared legitimate. She was dying, and Etta needed protection that only money and education could provide. "You'll take good care of her." "Naturally. She'll want for nothing." What Sarah couldn't see was the calculation behind Blackwood's pale eyes. He had been managing the trust fund for 8 years, skimming money and covering his tracks. He expected Etta to remain a controllable child who would never question his management of her inheritance. The longer she stayed away from the legal details, the more he could steal. Within a week, arrangements were complete. A fine carriage waited outside the Harper cabin, loaded with Etta's few possessions. The townspeople gathered to watch the spectacle of the poor washwoman's granddaughter leaving in luxury. Sarah held Etta close one final time. Her granddaughter had memorized every word of their conversations about the inheritance, every detail about her father's gift, and every feature of Blackwood's face. The child's remarkable memory had already begun cataloging information that would prove valuable years later. "Remember who you are," Sarah whispered. "Remember where you come from, and remember the promise you made." Etta climbed into the carriage beside Blackwood. Through the window, she saw Jed Coulter standing apart from the crowd. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw something that looked like regret. Then the carriage rolled away, carrying her toward a future none of them could imagine. The townspeople watched until the dust settled, already forgetting the little girl who had dared to dream of marrying the giant cowboy. 12 years transformed Etta Mee Harper from a frightened child into a formidable woman. Boston's finest finishing schools had refined her speech and manners, but her sharp mind remained unchanged. At 20, she moved through high society with grace while secretly studying every detail of her business affairs. The elegant brownstone mansion Blackwood had purchased for her education served as the perfect cover for his schemes. He presented himself as her devoted guardian, managing her inheritance with careful attention. What he didn't realize was that Etta's photographic memory had been working against him from the beginning. She remembered every financial document he had shown her over the years, every contract signature, every explanation about market fluctuations and necessary expenses. Her father's gift allowed her to catalog discrepancies that would have escaped most trained accountants. During her 3rd year in Boston, Etta began requesting copies of all financial records. Blackwood deflected her questions with patronizing smiles and assurances that such matters were too complex for her feminine mind to grasp. His mistake was underestimating the quiet intensity behind her polite demeanor. Etta enrolled in business courses at a women's college, claiming she wanted to understand literature and philosophy. Instead, she studied contract law, accounting principles, and investment strategies. Her instructors were amazed by her ability to memorize entire textbooks after reading them once. She absorbed legal precedents and financial regulations with the same precision her father had used to identify mineral deposits. By her 18th birthday, Etta had secretly compiled evidence of Blackwood's embezzlement. He had been skimming funds from her trust for over a decade, assuming she would never develop the knowledge to challenge his authority. Her inheritance had grown substantially through the copper mine's productivity, making his thefts even more significant. The revelation came during a routine meeting in Blackwood's office. He was explaining why her quarterly allowance needed to be reduced due to market conditions. Etta listened politely, then began reciting exact figures from documents he had shown her 3 years earlier. The copper mine produced $43,000 in revenue last quarter, she said calmly. The operational costs you listed don't match the expenses from the previous year's reports. In fact, they don't match any legitimate business expenditure I can identify. Blackwood's confident expression faltered. Etta continued speaking, citing numbers and dates with mechanical precision. She had memorized every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every lie he had told her since their first meeting. "You've stolen approximately $38,000 from my trust over the past 5 years, she concluded. Would you like to explain where that money has gone? The lawyer's composure cracked entirely. He began making excuses about administrative costs and legal fees, but Etta's relentless memory had already exposed every contradiction in his story. She had spent months quietly investigating his other clients through social connections in Boston society. Blackwood had been running the same scheme on multiple wealthy families, orphaned heirs and widows who trusted him to manage their affairs while he systematically drained their accounts. Etta's case was simply the largest and most profitable of his criminal enterprises. She also discovered that several prominent Boston families had begun questioning their own missing funds. Blackwood was facing pressure from multiple directions, and Etta's inheritance had become his primary source of emergency money to cover other thefts. Instead of confronting him directly, Etta began building a network of allies. She cultivated relationships with honest lawyers, federal marshals, and business leaders who could help her when the time came for justice. Her natural charm and obvious intelligence opened doors that would have remained closed to someone of her background in most circumstances. The final piece of her strategy involved gathering physical evidence of Blackwood's crimes. She used her access to his office and files to document his fraudulent activities across all his clients. Her photographic memory allowed her to spot patterns and connections that linked his various schemes together. During the winter of her 19th year, Etta made a decision that surprised even herself. She would return to Clearwater Creek. The sophisticated woman she had become needed to reconnect with the brave child who had made an impossible promise to a gentle giant. Blackwood initially resisted her plan to visit her childhood home, claiming that such a journey would be inappropriate for a refined Boston lady. Etta insisted with quiet determination that left no room for argument. She needed to see where her story began before she could decide how it would end. The lawyer's desperation grew more obvious as other wealthy families began demanding audits of their accounts. He started pressuring Etta to sign documents that would give him expanded control over her inheritance. She refused each request while secretly preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. Her final months in Boston were spent in careful preparation. Etta arranged for secure transportation of evidence to federal authorities. She established communication with law enforcement officials who specialized in financial crimes. Most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the challenge of returning to a place where she had been dismissed and forgotten. The night before her departure, Etta stood in her elegant bedroom and carefully packed items that represented both her past and her transformation. Her grandmother's Bible went into the traveling case alongside legal documents that would expose Blackwood's crimes. The patched dress she had worn as a child was folded next to silk gowns worth more than most families earned in a year. Blackwood made one final attempt to stop her journey, claiming urgent business matters required her attention in Boston. Etta's response was polite but final. She was returning to Clearwater Creek with or without his approval. The stagecoach that carried her west looked identical to the carriage that had brought her to Boston 12 years earlier. But the frightened child who had left was now a determined woman carrying the power to transform everything she touched. The stagecoach rolled into Clearwater Creek on a dusty afternoon in late spring. Etta Mee Harper stepped down wearing a traveling dress that cost more than most townspeople earned in 6 months. Her posture spoke of confidence and education, while her dark eyes surveyed the familiar streets with careful attention. 12 years had brought changes to the frontier town. New buildings lined the main street, and the population had nearly doubled. But the social dynamics remained unchanged. Etta watched white families move freely between shops while others were served reluctantly or turned away entirely. She registered at the town's only hotel under her full name. The desk clerk looked at her with obvious suspicion, taking her money while making it clear that refined appearances didn't change certain realities in Clearwater Creek. Etta accepted his hostility with practiced grace, having learned to navigate prejudice with dignity rather than confrontation. From her hotel window, she could see the town square where she had made her bold promise years ago. The memory felt both distant and immediate, like looking at someone else's life through perfectly clear glass. The frightened child who had declared her intention to marry the giant cowboy seemed like a character from a storybook. Jed Coulter still lived in the same small house on the edge of town. At 38, his reputation as the community's protector had only grown stronger. He settled disputes, helped struggling families, and maintained peace through quiet authority rather than violence. But those who knew him well recognized the loneliness that shadowed his kind eyes. He had never married. Several respectable women had shown interest over the years, but Jed had politely declined their advances. When pressed by friends about his solitary life, he would change the subject or find pressing work that required his immediate attention. The truth was that Jed carried the memory of a brave little girl who had looked at him without fear and declared her impossible dream. He told himself it was foolish to let childhood memories affect his adult decisions, but her courage had touched something deep in his heart that remained unreachable by anyone else. Etta spent her first days in town observing from a distance. She visited the general store where she had once been turned away and noted that the same prejudices still governed daily interactions. The bakery still served some customers while ignoring others. The church still had unspoken seating arrangements that reflected social hierarchies, but she also saw opportunities for change. The town was prospering from increased trade and settlement, creating demand for services and investments that could benefit everyone. Etta's trained eye identified businesses that needed capital, infrastructure that required improvement, and social problems that money could help solve. She began making small, anonymous contributions to struggling families. A widow's rent would mysteriously be paid in advance. A family's medical bills would disappear overnight. Children who had been denied schooling would find their fees covered by unknown benefactors. These acts of generosity puzzled the townspeople, who couldn't identify the source of the unexpected aid. Some suspected wealthy Eastern investors were considering projects in Clearwater Creek. Others believed the anonymous helper was someone with connections to powerful interests outside their community. Etta's careful anonymity served multiple purposes. She wanted to help people who needed assistance, but she also wanted to study how the community responded to change. Her philanthropic experiments revealed both the potential for progress and the resistance she would face when her identity became known. During her second week in town, Etta finally encountered Jed directly. She was leaving the telegraph office when she saw him helping an elderly man repair a broken wagon wheel. The years had added lines around his eyes and gray threads to his hair, but his gentle strength remained unchanged. Jed looked up from his work and their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, neither moved. Recognition flickered in his expression, followed immediately by confusion and disbelief. The elegant woman watching him bore no resemblance to the poor child he remembered, yet something in her gaze seemed familiar. That evening, Etta waited near the old oak tree behind the church where she used to sit and dream about her future. She knew Jed often walked this path after finishing his daily responsibilities. Her heart raced as she heard his footsteps approaching through the darkness. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said quietly. "Are you lost?" Etta stepped into the moonlight, allowing him to see her face clearly. When she spoke, her voice carried the same unwavering certainty it had possessed 12 years earlier. "Hello, Jed. I told you I'd marry you when I grew up." The recognition hit him like a physical blow. The sophisticated woman standing before him was unmistakably the brave child who had captured his heart years ago. But the transformation was so complete that he struggled to reconcile his memories with the reality before his eyes. "Etta me, how is this possible?" She explained about her inheritance, her education, and her decision to return to Clearwater Creek. Jed listened in amazement as the poor washwoman's granddaughter revealed herself to be an educated heiress with the power to transform their community. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "Because this is where I belong, because I made a promise, and because there are things that need to change." Etta swore him to secrecy about her true identity and wealth. She needed time to implement her plans before the community learned who she really was. Jed agreed, though he struggled to understand why she wanted to hide advantages that could make her life easier. Their conversation lasted until dawn, bridging 12 years of separation with shared memories and new possibilities. When they finally parted, both carried the weight of secrets that would soon reshape everything they had ever known about love, justice, and the power of keeping impossible promises. Etta continued her anonymous good works throughout the following weeks, but her presence was stirring unease in certain circles. The town's established families began whispering about the mysterious woman who seemed to have unlimited resources and questionable motives for helping the wrong sort of people. Mayor Harrison called a town meeting to discuss what he termed outside influences that were disrupting the natural order of their community. He spoke carefully, avoiding direct accusations while making it clear that some residents were concerned about changes they couldn't understand or control. "We've built a good town here," he announced to the gathered crowd. "We know our neighbors, we understand our place, and we maintain the peace through mutual respect for how things have always been done." Several prominent citizens nodded in agreement. The banker, the general store owner, and the largest ranch owner had noticed shifts in their workers' attitudes. People who had always accepted their circumstances without complaint were beginning to ask questions about wages and working conditions. Etta sat in the back of the meeting hall, observing how power operated in Clearwater Creek. The same families who had dismissed her as a child now controlled the town's economic and social structures. They viewed her charitable works as threats to their authority rather than improvements to the community. After the meeting, she overheard conversations that revealed the depth of resistance she would face. These people weren't just protecting their financial interests. They were defending a worldview that required certain individuals to remain powerless for the system to function as they preferred. That night, Etta made a decision that would accelerate everything. She began purchasing property through intermediaries in nearby towns, using her inheritance to quietly acquire land and buildings throughout Clearwater Creek. Her lawyers handled the transactions with such discretion that the sellers never realized they were dealing with the same mysterious benefactor. Within a month, Etta owned the livery stable, 2 boarding houses, a large tract of undeveloped land near the railroad tracks, and several smaller commercial properties. Her strategy was to create economic opportunities that would benefit everyone while demonstrating the power of inclusive prosperity. But her activities had not gone completely unnoticed. Cornelius Blackwood had been tracking her movements since she left Boston, growing increasingly desperate as his other clients demanded audits of their accounts. He knew that Etta's return to her childhood home represented a dangerous shift in her priorities that could expose his crimes. Blackwood arrived in Clearwater Creek on a Tuesday morning, bringing with him forged documents and a carefully crafted story designed to destroy Etta's credibility before she could threaten his freedom. He registered at the same hotel where Etta was staying, then began making inquiries about her activities among the town's leading citizens. His approach was subtle but effective. He presented himself as a concerned guardian who had traveled from Boston to investigate reports of his ward's erratic behavior. According to Blackwood's account, Etta was suffering from a mental condition that made her unsuitable for managing her inheritance independently. "It's not uncommon in cases like hers," he explained to Mayor Harrison over dinner. "The combination of sudden wealth and certain hereditary factors can create delusions of grandeur and poor judgment. I've seen it before in families with similar backgrounds." Blackwood showed carefully forged medical documents that supported his claims about Etta's mental state. He also produced legal papers suggesting that her spending in Clearwater Creek was unauthorized and potentially criminal. The documents looked official enough to convince people who wanted to believe his story. The mayor and other town leaders found Blackwood's explanation satisfying because it confirmed their existing prejudices. They had never been comfortable with a woman of Etta's background wielding financial power in their community. The lawyer's story provided them with a respectable reason to oppose her activities. Word spread quickly through the town's gossip networks. By evening, most residents had heard some version of the story about the disturbed woman who had been deceiving them with stolen money. The same people who had benefited from her anonymous charity began questioning whether they had been unwittingly participating in criminal activities. Etta learned about Blackwood's arrival from Jed, who had heard the rumors and immediately recognized the danger she faced. The community's attitude toward her had shifted dramatically in a single day. People who had been politely distant were now openly hostile. "He's telling everyone you're mentally unfit to handle your inheritance," Jed warned her during a hurried meeting behind the church. "He has documents that look official. Most people are believing his story." Etta's response surprised him with its calmness. She had been expecting Blackwood's arrival and had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation. Her photographic memory contained every detail of his criminal activities, and her network of allies in Boston had been gathering additional evidence of his schemes. "Let him tell his story," she said quietly. "Tomorrow, I'll tell mine." That night, Etta reviewed the evidence she had compiled against Blackwood. Her documentation of his embezzlement was thorough and irrefutable, but she knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the town's willingness to believe his lies about her mental capacity and criminal behavior. She also knew that federal marshals were already investigating Blackwood's activities in Boston, based on information she had provided months earlier. Her return to Clearwater Creek had been timed to coincide with the conclusion of their investigation, ensuring that legal authority would support her accusations. The next morning brought the confrontation that would determine not only Etta's future, but the character of the entire community. Blackwood had called for a public meeting, where he intended to formally declare Etta mentally incompetent and assume control of her inheritance. As townspeople gathered in the square where she had once made her impossible promise, Etta prepared to reveal the truth about everything. Her childhood dreams, her inherited wealth, her years of preparation, and most importantly, the criminal who had tried to destroy her before she could challenge his authority. The battle for her future was about to begin. The town square filled with curious residents drawn by news of the public meeting. Blackwood stood on the courthouse steps wearing his finest suit, projecting an image of professional authority that impressed the gathered crowd. His forged documents were organized in a leather portfolio, and his expression conveyed appropriate concern for his allegedly unstable ward. Etta arrived precisely at noon, walking through the crowd with quiet dignity. She carried a simple canvas bag that contained 12 years of carefully preserved evidence. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from Blackwood as he realized she intended to defend herself publicly. Mayor Harrison called the meeting to order and invited Blackwood to present his case. The lawyer spoke eloquently about his legal obligations as Etta's guardian and his deep concern for her welfare. He described her unauthorized spending in Clearwater Creek as evidence of mental deterioration that required immediate intervention. Miss Harper has been living under delusions about her financial status and legal authority, Blackwood announced to the crowd. The documents I have here prove that she is legally incompetent to manage her affairs independently. He displayed the forged medical certificates and fraudulent legal papers with practiced showmanship. Several townspeople nodded in agreement, finding his explanation more comfortable than accepting that a woman of Etta's background could possess legitimate wealth and authority. When Blackwood finished his presentation, Mayor Harrison asked if Etta had anything to say in her defense. She stepped forward, opened her canvas bag, and began pulling out documents that made Blackwood's confident expression falter immediately. "Mr. Blackwood is correct about one thing," Etta said clearly. "There has been criminal activity involving my inheritance. However, he's the one who committed the crimes." She began reciting dates, amounts, and transaction details with mechanical precision. Her photographic memory allowed her to cite specific examples of Blackwood's embezzlement spanning nearly a decade. Each accusation was supported by documentary evidence that she displayed for the crowd to examine. "On March 15, 1876, you withdrew $800 from my trust account claiming legal fees for property maintenance. The actual legal fees were $63. Where did the remaining money go?" Blackwood tried to interrupt with explanations about administrative costs and market fluctuations, but Etta continued methodically exposing each fraudulent transaction. Her relentless recitation of facts created a damning pattern that became impossible to dismiss or explain away. The crowd's mood began shifting as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This woman possessed detailed knowledge of complex financial matters that contradicted everything Blackwood had told them about her mental capacity. Her accusations were specific, documented, and delivered with unshakable confidence. Etta then revealed evidence of Blackwood's crimes against other clients in Boston. She named prominent families who had discovered missing funds and identified patterns linking their losses to his fraudulent management practices. Her network of allies had provided sworn statements from other victims who had suffered similar thefts. "The federal marshals in Boston have been investigating Mr. Blackwood's activities for 6 months, she announced. "They're particularly interested in his forgery of legal documents and his theft of funds belonging to multiple clients." As if summoned by her words, 2 federal marshals rode into the square. They had been waiting at the edge of town for Etta's signal, ready to make arrests based on evidence she had been providing to authorities for months. Their timing was perfect, lending official weight to her accusations just when Blackwood was beginning to recover his composure. Marshal Thompson stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. "Cornelius Blackwood, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. We have warrants issued by federal courts in Massachusetts based on evidence provided by Miss Harper and other victims of your crimes." The arrest transformed everything. Townspeople who had been prepared to dismiss Etta as mentally unfit suddenly found themselves witnesses to the capture of a sophisticated criminal who had nearly succeeded in stealing her inheritance. Blackwood's carefully constructed lies collapsed under the weight of federal authority and documented proof. But Etta wasn't finished with her revelations. She turned to address the crowd directly, explaining her true identity and her reasons for returning to Clearwater Creek. She spoke about her inheritance, her education, and her desire to use her resources to benefit the entire community. 12 years ago, I made a promise in this same square, she said, looking directly at Jed. I told a kind man that I would marry him when I grew up. Today, I'm ready to keep that promise if he'll have me. Jed stepped forward from the crowd, his face showing amazement and deep emotion. The gentle giant who had protected a frightened child was now being offered a partnership with the remarkable woman she had become. His answer came without hesitation. I've been waiting 12 years to hear those words again. Their embrace in the center of the square symbolized more than personal happiness. It represented the possibility of change, the power of keeping promises, and the triumph of dignity over prejudice. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as their assumptions about worth, capability, and social order were fundamentally challenged. In the weeks that followed, Etta revealed her property purchases and outlined her vision for Clearwater Creek's future. She proposed investments in schools, businesses, and infrastructure that would create opportunities for everyone regardless of background. Her approach emphasized economic growth and social progress rather than charity or revenge. The wedding took place 2 months later in the same town square where everything had begun. The entire community attended, including families who had once dismissed Etta as a foolish child with impossible dreams. The celebration marked not just the union of two people who had found their way back to each other, but the transformation of a community that had learned to see beyond its own prejudices. Etta Mee Harper had kept her promise, and in doing so had changed everything.